king must win, the rest is dust.
Hola mundanos. Hoy tenemos en el canal a Joe Abercrombie, escritor de fantasía de sagas como La Primera Ley o El Mar Quebrado. Os aconsejo que vayáis a ver la entrevista que le ha hecho Sebas, el conectadista del mundo que está detrás de la cámara, que seguro que mola mucho, pero bueno, espero que también disfrutéis de esta. You confess yourself a nerd. Maybe it's a little bit more difficult for younger people. They feel like more pressed for their peers. What would you say to them?
Well, I think we all feel kind of outcast growing up. As a kid, I played a lot of role-playing games, played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, read a lot of books, and they weren't necessarily things that were considered cool. I can remember, a teacher when I was drawing a little map, my own break time, a teacher saying, "Nothing's ever going to come of that," and I have had the last laugh. I think you've got to use your imagination and do whatever you enjoy. Something will come out. Got to be yourself.
You said that you read a lot of books, not just about fantasy, I imagine, but any other genre.
Yeah.
How do you use those other kind of stories in your own?
It's always hard to tell exactly what you take from something. And sometimes you'll read a scene in a book you've read a long time ago and think, oh, that's where I got that. But there's certainly, James Ellroy, the thriller writer, he has an amazing style of really getting inside the head of his characters. Writes almost in a different way depending on the character he's writing from the point of view of. A lot of the fantasy I read as a kid takes a very omniscient view, doesn't really get into their heads that much. I suppose I was always interested in taking that very character-focused approach.
What do you think that as a writer and as a reader, a character must have so that you consider it a deep enough character, a good enough character?
Yeah, I don't think there's one recipe. Part of it is kind of instinctive. When I'm creating a new character, I'll obviously think about the technical things, their appearance, who they are, what's their history, where do they come from, what's the role they're playing in the story, what mannerisms might they have, what things might fit together to make a compelling person. But in the end, until you write from their point of view, until you write their dialogue, their way of thinking, their way of looking at the world, you're always a bit surprised by what comes out. Sometimes a character will work really nicely right from the start, but more often it takes a few chapters or maybe even a whole book from their point of view before I really feel I know who this person is. And then it's a case of going back and applying that voice you've developed. Voice, if you like, that sense of a unique person talking to you. That's the thing I really respond to when I'm reading a book and when I'm reading another writer's characters.
The thing about your characters is that they're not just deep, but they are also different to the kind of cliche characters we read, especially in fantasy. Is it something that you do willingly, consciously, or it just happens?
When I first sat down to write, I wasn't really thinking in that way. I really just wanted to write a classic fantasy story in the way I liked, in a way I maybe hadn't seen that much. So I wanted it to have humour, I wanted it to be shocking, I wanted it to be character focused and to kind of be very visceral and for the action to feel, scary and involving and like the reader was really caught up in a fight rather than just watching it from a distance. I suppose I wanted the characters to feel honest. A lot of the characters I read in fantasy didn't feel like real people. A warrior who nobly decides to charge into the enemy. I wanted to really get inside the heads of the characters, the kind of characters you might see in fantasy, but to make them feel really believable and as human as possible. With the first four books, certainly I was looking at some very classic fantasy types. A wizardly mentor, an old wise wizard who guides a hero to his special destiny. Taking those very, quite cliched types in a way, but wanting to do something slightly new with them, to do something surprising with them. And I think the nature of the characters just grew naturally out of that sense of wanting to make everything feel as believable and honest as I could.
It's often said that classic fantasy doesn't have much of a role.
Yeah.
And in the Shattered Sea trilogy, we find Thorn.
Espina.
Yes.
Yeah.
Faces the problem to become a warrior in between a world of men. Did you have the goal to be inclusive? Like, I wanted to talk about this problem, or it was just something that the story needed?
I was reading The Hobbit to my daughter. I noticed there are no female characters in The Hobbit at all. And I think fantasy has often been very light on the female characters. When I wrote my first books, the First Law, it was back in 2001, there wasn't the same criticism available on the internet. I hadn't read a lot of feminist criticism of fantasy or any of these things, and so I wasn't thinking about the role of women particularly. I think there are, a couple of good female characters in the First Law, but they'd be much stronger books with many more. With Best Served Cold, my fourth book, I had a female central character, but a lot of men still around. When it came to doing The Shattered Sea, and I was designing a world from scratch, I felt like I wanted to try and design a world that really had lots of roles for women and made it very easy and straightforward and natural to bring a lot of female characters straight into the story in all kinds of different roles. It was based on the Viking world, partly, but in the Viking world there was perhaps women had quite a lot more power than in the Christian world that was around them at the time. I had this idea that a society where men took responsibility for warfare and kind of physical work, but women were responsible for the household, and that had grown to become knowledge, money, trade. And it's at a time where money is becoming much more powerful and important, and trade is becoming more important. And so the Queen is responsible for the finances of the nation, and the Queen of this particular country has become much more powerful, in fact, than the King. I was able to, bring in all kinds of female characters in a lot of varied roles. I think it just makes for a much better and more interesting book, although the first book has a male hero and he's forced to become a minister, kind of take a female role. In the second book I wanted to investigate the opposites, a girl who's determined to become a warrior and kind of assert herself in the male sphere. I just found those to be two interesting kind of mirror stories to tell.
When you were writing it, did it change the way your creative process to know that you were having a different target reader?
When I write an adult book, I think, what's the kind of book I want to read? If you're thinking too much about readers, you'll go wrong in a way, because you've got to please yourself first. So when I was writing these books, I was really thinking, what's the kind of book I like to read at 12, at 14? And it's basically the same kind of book I like now. Young adults are adults, they're just young. That's kind of obvious. I suppose they're people who are dealing with serious things in their lives for the first time, with power, with work, with big decisions, with sex. I wanted these books to be dark, to be challenging, to be honest about all those things. They're a little less visceral, a little less gory, a little less intense on the details, but I was consciously taking a slightly different tone, I suppose. But the main difference for me was that I'd written big, epic fantasy books. So I wanted to experiment with how small and tight I can make a book and still have it feel epic in that way. It was more a case of boiling things down and trying to be as tight and focused as I could, rather than to somehow make it simpler or make it, less challenging. I mean, I also wanted to very much write books that my adult readers could still enjoy.
You revealed in former interviews that you're currently working on a new trilogy. As that has already been revealed, could you reveal something else, an exclusive? You can say no, but I hope you don't.
An exclusive, I'm trying to think of something exclusive to say. I'm kind of in the planning process, so I wrote the First Law trilogy, then I wrote 3 standalone books in the same world. So the idea with this trilogy is to pick up a little more from where the first trilogy left off, maybe 20, 30 years on. So the central characters of this trilogy, some of them are children of characters we met before. So they're a new generation of characters really, while some familiar faces move into the older roles, if you like, and are in the background. And because I like worlds that grow and change and develop, it has a slightly more industrial flavour. Canals, factories, coal, a bit of smoke. It's a world in a great deal of flux and change, with a lot of social pressures going on.
As I have repeated a lot of questions that you probably have been asked a lot of times before, which one is the question that you have never been asked and that you have always wanted to answer?
The question
and
I've
which
never
one
been
would be the
asked.
answer, of course?
I don't know.
For example, maybe there's something you have always been very proud of and no one has given you the opportunity to brag about it.
So, well, I mean, I think the female characters one is one area that I've improved on a lot. It does make a book much richer. You get different style of relationships. In the second book, Half the World, there's a scene where a female smith and a female warrior make the metal for a sword together. When I first started writing, I would never, ever have written that scene, because a smith would have been male and a warrior would have been male. The nature of that scene is very different between 2 female characters, and I feel very pleased that there's that range in this book as a result.
Esto ha sido todo el vídeo de hoy. Nos vemos la semana que viene, como siempre, a las 6:30. Y hasta entonces, paz.
Vale.
Weasley y Albus Dumbledore son la misma persona y que en realidad Dumbledore es Ron que ha viajado al pasado. I mean, this man here, he considers himself a nerd. That's a victory for us nerds, I think.